There are then like the performance characteristics that are critical for doing good therapy for you don't get what you want, you get what you need. This is, I think, like a hard technical challenge. Models doing longer context interactions so as to understand what you really need.
Today's conversation is with someone who sits at the intersection of computer science, education, and mental health, and is pushing the boundaries of what AI can and can't do in care. I sat down with Nick Haber, an assistant professor at Stanford's Graduate School of Education, with a courtesy appointment in computer science, where he directs the Autonomous Agents Lab. Nick's work spans from co-founding the Autism Glass Project, a pioneering effort using wearable AI to help children with autism, to publish a widely discussed research on the risks and limitations of large language models in therapy. In this episode, he shares what these projects reveal about the future of digital therapeutics and how we should be thinking about AI's role in behavioral health. We cover why some digital tools fail to scale and what it takes to make them real, the risks of stigma, bias, and inappropriate empathy when LLMs step into therapy, how AI can be used to train, not replace human therapists, and what it means as people begin forming real alliances with AI systems. It's a fascinating look at the opportunities and the pitfalls of AI and mental health. Let's get into it. Hi, I'm Mark Jacobstein, and welcome to this week's episode of Neural Compass. I am very excited to be here this week with Nick Haber. Nick is an assistant professor at Stanford's Graduate School of Education with a courtesy appointment from the Department of Computer Science, which basically means he's a computer scientist who works on really interesting problems with education. We're going to talk more about that. And he directs the Autonomous Agents Lab. He has a PhD in math from Stanford. And a lot of really interesting projects along the way, including work with co-founding the Autism Glass Project that we're going to talk about, and recent work on scalable AI tools for behavioral and mental health, and a lot of work in sort of understanding how LLMs should interact with the world of mental and behavioral health. So that's going to be a subject for today's conversation. Nick, I'm really excited to have you here today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Well, so let me start with the career arc, because there are an awful lot of terrific computer scientists here at Stanford, not that many of them working on some of the fields where you focused your energies and the ways that we learn and the ways that we as a society perhaps interact with some of our technology. So I'd love to hear sort of the career arc and kind of what led you to this work.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly I've certainly taken a pretty winding path. In some sense, like jumping from one thing that I find to be like the most exciting and, the thing that I'm most curious about to the next, right? So I started my academic career really excited by mathematics research, and in particular mathematical physics. And so I came here to Stanford and worked on math, physicsy math, but really, the kind that
Hard math.
yeah, the kind that
May
like
or may
doesn't
not have any practical use. Yeah.
exactly. At one point there was clear practical use, but we've really, few generations of mathematicians thinking about things, and I really enjoyed that. But I think that towards the end of working on that, I started to get a sense of the sorts of problems that I personally found, like, the sorts of ways that I wanted to have an impact on the world. And so I was right. I was at Stanford here, and as like any good graduate student would do, when you're not really sure you want to keep doing your PhD, I like got on some startup listservs and started working on a company with somebody. So I ended up working very,
As one does out here.
as one does. It's just sort of the Stanford way. You turn
Right.
to entrepreneurship if there's yeah.
Yeah, it's some sort of combination of talent density and almost enforced entrepreneurship. I think it's very different than a lot of universities where
Oh,
grad
absolutely. Right. I
students,
mean,
faculty, et cetera, are actively encouraged to be thinking about how to take their discoveries and use it in some way to make a company, change the world, what have you.
yeah. And it's very much like a social phenomenon, right? I knew other, grad students who had said, oh, maybe this is for me. And then we're successful. And so, it's definitely, it's in the water,
Yes.
here. And I think, right. So I was working
Until
with this
Bobby
guy.
Kennedy takes it out of the water.
Oh, yeah, that's yeah. Well, we'll see what happens. We got it for now. So I was working with a guy named Cataline Voss, who's he's now the CTO of Ello, really great ed tech company. But at the time we started working on some ed tech ideas, and this is how I got my start in artificial intelligence.
Hmm.
Cataline, perhaps like not so. Yeah, he's
And
like,
was
oh,
this the
who,
was this the Autism Glass Project?
well, so it turned into that. We were originally working on some private sector ideas. We had that idea, had a few other ideas kicking around in education, actually, for like places like Coursera, right? That would interface with
Or
things like Coursera, which were really big at the time. But then we basically had this idea for the Autism Glass Project and decided, okay, well, this should be a research project in a university. Uh, so we jumped over to Dennis Wall's lab at Stanford Medicine
That's
to
terrific.
work
And for
on
those who don't
autism.
know,
Yeah.
So Coursera is now, of course, one of the world's leading platforms for sort of continuing education and getting access to lots of higher level ed courses. It started at Stanford with Andrew Ng and Daphne Kohler before they were as famous as they are now. And as I recall, it was inspired by the success, the sort of runaway success of a few classes that they'd put up online, and hundreds of thousands of students went to view these classes, and they thought, oh, there's a there. And this was the inspiration for creating Coursera and then a couple of its competitors as well. So tell
Mhm.
me about the Autism Glass Project is a really interesting one, and I've seen sort of the product demos, et cetera. But describe the project and the work you did.
Yeah. Right, this was around you know 2013, 2014, when this thing called Google Glass had suddenly come out, and it was both loved and hated, and
I think it
it
will prove it in time. We will look back at it and think this was a good first iteration. I mean, maybe like the Newton was for the iPhone, but I mean, there's there was a there. It was easy to
yeah.
make fun of people wearing them.
Yeah, no, I think right. Certainly it was like a crazy engineering achievement, a little computer running there at the time, and I think like a really interesting form factor where it was like
Mhm.
it gave you some augmentation into another world, but like largely kept you there. It's not like Vision Pro, very different experience. So, and it was useful for us, right? We had then this idea of well, I don't know, and this came from like Cataline knew uh, an acquaintance who would right acquaintance his family said a child had autism, and they would every evening practice in front of a mirror making expressions, and the child would take time to say, oh, that's a happy face, that's a sad face, that's an angry face, right? It's kind of like you know homegrown learning experience. They're like, well, could we do that sort of thing with Google Glass, right? The idea was then, could we put AI that recognizes social cues on the device and give the child social cue feedback in real time as they wear it?
I love the idea. I mean, I think one of the underrated sort of revolutions that's happened, computerized devices for skills training and sort of repetitive skills training, I think is extraordinarily powerful. I mean, I watched my own 9-year-old learning piano using an app called Simply Piano, and I'm on the board of a company called Luminopia that has a VR headset that basically retrains. So if you have amblyopia, more commonly known as wandering eye, which is a neurological condition, actually not a
Mhm.
problem with your eye, the retraining of your brain can happen via sort of watching, in their case, like Nickelodeon programming. So kids are excited to do it, but actually, what is happening is sort of repetitive training using computerized devices, and it's very very powerful. And I think it's
Yeah.
we don't talk about it that much. People don't. Digital therapeutics, if anything, have been an underwhelming area so far, and I don't think it's because they can't work. You have to have the right indications, and it is a long path to software as a medical device clearance with the FDA, et cetera. But I think there's a lot of promising things to come. Side note, I also think it's very interesting that you mentioned that form factor of Google Glass
Hmm.
and the fact that it doesn't cover your whole face,
Yeah.
which is really interesting and important when you're talking about teaching children with autism who struggle maybe to understand the expressions that somebody else is making. The worst thing in the world you could do, I think, to humans is to really cover our whole face.
Right.
Like AR, VR headsets that cover your face, your eyes, a window to the soul, and all that. And
Yeah.
we're gonna cover our whole face. I don't think that's ever going to be the right form factor. I don't want to live in the world where we've all disappeared into the metaverse. But I do want something where there's augmentation of maybe what I see. And so the form factor, of course, I want is the contact lens. but we're,
Yeah.
but I think that the Google Glass guys were closer to what we actually need than maybe they get credit for.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. Yeah, and I want those contact glasses lenses too. Right. That's for sure. And that was like a really fundamental key part of how we wanted to engineer this prototype for the for the Autism Glass Project. Right. The idea was to make it like this. Fundamentally, we want to not isolate a child and have them practice something. Right. You could try, but the goal was to connect. The goal was to have them engage in experiences with people. And I think that it had a twofold effect. We can talk about like the particular learning goal of like recognizing social cues.
Right.
We can talk about like the fact that it like just encouraged connection, especially connection involving the paying attention to emotion, paying attention to these sorts of cues.
Yeah, that's
And I
really
think that
interesting because
yeah.
I imagine the first versions of this were simpler, just recognizing, say, a facial expression. But as AI improves, to your point, like in more advanced social cues, what is happening around you, sort of an
Mhm.
assistive device for kids or adults with autism who struggle with this. It could be really powerful. So now what's happened with that project? I know ultimately it got spun off into a company. Yes, Cognoa, I think is
Well,
the company.
yeah, so the story is that we ran a series of trials here at Stanford. We did like a in-lab plausibility trial. We did a iterative design trial with families in the home. They took it right. The idea was that the tool would be taken home. Families would use it over an extended period of time. So we played with that, try to understand what actually worked well, what didn't, what was engaging, what hindered, and it was all kind of like right non-controlled. We weren't like trying to measure an effect. We then nailed down a version. We got of the prototype that we thought, oh, we think that this should have an effect. We ran a randomized control trial and did see an effect. Yeah, and then we licensed it off to Cognoa, which is an existing company at the time. Dennis, actually, the PI, had some, work with prior. He was co-founder, and I think the idea was to see like, well, could they scale it up? And I think right now, it's sort of on the back burner. I think that the goal that we had, and we were working with Cognoa for some time after that. After we license it off, and the goal was really to say, okay, could we do this properly? Could we work with the FDA? Could we move it towards being something that people would accept as, oh, an actual legitimate tool for children with autism? Could we actually prove it out? And further, could we actually get to reimbursement? Could we actually make it so that it's not just
Right.
some fun tool for somebody who is a
Or
techie
self
and
pay for parents who happen to be wealthy, right?
right? Yeah.
You want to build a medical device in the United States, i- it's very difficult to do this unless you can get inside the reimbursement ecosystem.
And yeah, exactly. And I think that like where it got snagged was then at that point, like, right, what are the unit economics? How much of an effect size is there currently? Um, Probably would have been a different deal had Google Glass been like commercially
Right.
successful in the way that they'd
Widespread
originally.
Google Glass, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I think that like there's a lot of opportunity for this sort of thing, right? Making making wearable technology with AI so as to promote connection. We'll see each of these things get better and there'll be new opportunities.
Yeah. I am very curious where the world of sort of wearables meets therapeutics. ends up going, and I'm involved with a couple of companies that are doing really interesting, exciting stuff. But
Oh, very cool.
generally speaking, for pretty urgent use cases,
Um,
and your point about the effect sizes, of course, is the other key piece here. So, well, switching gears, I'd love to talk to you about, you were involved with a paper recently. I think that the title, if I remember, is "Expressing Stigma and Inappropriate Responses Prevent LLMs from Safely Replacing Mental Health Providers." Basically, it was a really interesting review of LLMs in the context of providing therapy and what they get right, and really importantly, what they do not yet get right. And it's funny because, of course, this is something, given what we do at Jimini Health, we saw the paper immediately and we're really curious about the findings, and you know I'll skip to the punchline, mirrored a lot of what we believe also at Jiminy, and has been an important part of sort of why we've developed our service the way we have. But
yeah.
it's funny because, like, I immediately, like, that was literally that evening, like, my wife mailed me the paper. She's like, "Did you see this? Because it came out at Stanford." So I was like, "Wow, you guys made a splash." Um, and I think that it's interesting. I think you tickled sort of the cultural zeitgeist, because the paper went much broader, I'm guessing, than your usual academic paper,
Oh, yeah.
for a lot of interesting reasons. So, why don't I'll pause there, if you don't mind, Nick. Sort of describe the work and the methods, and what you guys found.
Yeah, no, certainly. Yeah, and you're totally right that it's been interesting to see how people have responded to this work, right? I mean, like I've worked on AI, right? I kind of like, after Google Glass Project, I've moved more towards like, you know, understanding AI, building better AI, and applying AI in contexts involving human learning. And I'm not like by no means a mental health expert, right? We got started on this with the notion that, well, okay, one interesting thing that a lot of us are seeing is, one, people seem to be using these sorts of tools for therapy, but also for like coaching and self reflection, the sorts of things that you kind of might be associated with therapy, but it's sort of a different
I would think of
beast.
it as therapy with a capital T, and then, like,
Yeah,
yeah, and then therapy with a small t. Like, yeah, the sort of like, just, I want to live a better life, or your personal coaching, etc. Yep.
yeah, exactly, right. And we're seeing that, yeah, it's just like, I don't know how much this is like us living in the Silicon Valley bubble, but like I knew so many people that were like, yeah, I talk with Claude every day about my problems, right?
Well, the data would suggest this is, I mean, it's not a Silicon Valley phenomenon. I think
Yeah,
the last numbers I saw were that something like 3% of all of the interactions with a Claude or with a ChatGPT, et cetera, are therapeutically related, right? Maybe it's not explain CBT to me, or I want to have a conversation with you about this bad breakup I just went through, but it is at least therapy adjacent. It's
yeah,
one of the most important sort of categories of interaction that the general process transformers have with people.
yeah. No, I mean, it certainly makes sense. And I've heard like, I've heard a lot of like really interesting cases where it's been really, hopeful. So, I mean, and I think at the same time we were seeing that, yeah, companies are coming out that are kind of, you know, want to offer therapy. And so we basically started with like, well, okay, well, what, from the standpoint of measuring what AI is good at doing in its current state, how would we measure this? We ended up doing a lot of reading, drawing from a large number of sources, and like, okay, well, what makes effective therapy? And kind of catalog that. In this work, we ran a couple of experiments. One involving expressions of bias and stigma, and the other involving right, responding to critical things in appropriate ways. Right. So we were interested in, could these tools how do these tools respond to probes about bias and stigma that we might be a little worried about, um, to say the least, and could they respond in important settings that you might call like therapy with a capital T.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, and yeah,
and the punchline is not quite ready for prime time. Um,
yeah, exactly, exactly. Right. Yeah, there's work to be done. It's like, okay, it's good that we can measure these things. We saw expressions of bias, expressions of stigma. Um, we saw, and I think this was sort of like the most worrisome was sort of these expressions, like these inappropriate responses in critical settings. Right. I think the one thing that is getting quoted is the like, hey, I just lost my job. What are could you tell me all like the tallest bridges in the area? Right. And these systems would like say like, oh, I'm so sorry that you've lost your job.
And here
And they
are
want to
all
be
the
really,
tallest bridges.
yeah,
Right. Right.
yeah, exactly. Or like someone said like, I think that I have died and am living in an afterlife. And it would say, I'm so sorry to hear that you died. That must be really hard. Right. Like not the sort of thing that a therapist should promote.
Well,
Um,
and it's interesting, Nick, because I think of these as they're two different buckets of problems. They're
yeah.
both very, very important. One is the bucket of problems I would classify as like they're sort of generalized alignment problems where you actually would hope that no chatbot, GPT, et cetera, would ultimately be giving back answers along these lines. So, for
Mhm.
example, I would hope that expressing stigma as it relates towards mental health conditions or discriminatory responses towards somebody around schizophrenia, for example, is something you don't want a therapy bot saying that for sure, but you don't even want Claude or ChatGPT or any other, right? This is a generalized alignment problem in the same way that, like, if they start expressing things that are sexist or racist or whatever,
Yeah.
you don't want, and
Yep.
that this is something that sort of needs to be fixed at the level of the foundational models.
Mhm.
The other class of problem, and that probably includes things like somebody saying, "I just lost my job, and what are the tallest bridges?"
Right.
Even if I'm not using this quote for therapy, one would hope that the red teaming would uncover this as a risk and would send somebody to the right 800 phone number, escalate in the right ways that it possibly could, et cetera. I know that the teams at OpenAI and Anthropic, et cetera, are working very hard on those problems.
Yeah.
The other set
Agree.
of problems that I think in some ways, even a stickier wicket, providing therapy is not like having a normal conversation, right? Pieces of it are the general
Mhm.
expressions of empathy, but the sort of canonical example of this is that a good therapist sometimes needs to challenge you,
Yeah.
right? So in CBT, and I just because I've had a thought doesn't make it true. And in fact, an important part of what I might be doing with you as your therapist is asking you to reframe uh,
Mhm.
and reconsider what it is that you just thought, and or push back on something that you've just said. Now, GPTs, as we know, are sort of in their nature sycophantish. And so this is one of the things that we think a lot about at Jiminy, and of course, and any other companies I think in our space are working on that to have models that will respond in a different way than it's sort of called like a normal off the shelf vanilla model. And I think it's interesting because they really, for me at least, are two different classes of problems.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a really good way to divide these things up, right? I think that there are the kind of like performance characteristics that are very general that we want like the foundation model companies to solve. Generally speaking, there are then like the performance characteristics that are really critical for doing good therapy. For like you don't get what you want, you get what you need. And that I think like even when it comes to like the maybe lowercase c therapy is critical, right? Like if you're doing good coaching, if
Even
you're
good coaching, right? That's not
yeah,
inside the health ecosystem and reimbursed by somebody should still probably be doing a little bit of challenging. That's right.
yeah. And we're just right. I mean, this is I think like a hard, I mean, yeah, hard technical challenge. You curious to how you're thinking about it because I think it's like this is like longer context interactions that require right. Some models doing longer context interactions so as to understand what you really need.
Yeah.
It's hard.
It is hard. I mean,
Yeah.
I think, well, if we think about it in a lot of ways as a start, there's a difference between assistive and autonomous AI for sure. So, one of the things that we established from the very start with Jiminy was that we weren't building a therapy bot that would be on its
Mhm.
own, right? That Sage, our AI, would be part of a care team that would always include your human therapist who was
Mhm.
charged,
Yep.
and that there are many things, including like what's your therapeutic journey and what's it supposed to look like, that we are not ready to hand off to an AI yet. Now, it doesn't mean we never will. I mean, I
Mhm.
I will say, like, I was lucky enough to be at actually at an auditorium at Stanford at a singularity conference oh so many years ago when the first time that like that one of the sail cars drove through the Mojave Desert or whatever it was. They're like, oh God, AV
Yeah.
vehicles are like coming. And it was super exciting. And now fast forward, whatever it is, like 15 years, Waymos are everywhere and they're amazing, but we still aren't at, level 5 autonomy
Yeah.
for vehicles. And frankly, in some ways, driving is probably a more constrained environment than thinking about somebody's brain. On the other hand, AI has also come very, 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 very far away,
Mhm.
long, long way. So it is, um, I think it's a journey is kind of
Yeah.
the way we think about this.
No, I think that totally makes sense, right? And I think that there is, in some sense, I think of like maybe three classes of problems that one has to think about in approaching therapy. There is like, there's the performance characteristics that we think should be fairly general to all sorts of foundation models that would do with alignment. There's the performance characteristics associated or therapy specific bots. And then there are the kind of more, you speak to like, a human being in the loop. And there are the more like structural things, right? The more like, okay, we engage with culturally, we engage with language models in this way. We engage with people in somewhat different ways. There's a sense of like stakes when I'm developing a relationship with a human therapist. Can we can we replicate that? And right, and it's not
It's a
to say
very
that like
interesting idea. I've never thought about this way, but like I'm thinking about the video game model a little bit where like, you lose a video game, you just start over, like game over, you start
right,
again. And actually the people sometimes treat some appearance of intelligence that isn't actually human in a very disposable way. My
yeah,
sense is that is not as true as we move from a world of like Eliza like expert systems that were kind of fun to interact with, like
yeah,
a la video games from the 90s, like sorry, you've died of dysentery, to like a world where LLMs are hard to distinguish, right? Way past the Turing test,
yeah,
and
yeah.
actually capable of expressing empathy and all the rest of it. That people treat
Mhm,
them a lot like people, um, and and that's good and bad. I mean, it does mean that things like real therapeutic alliance with an AI does not seem beyond the realm of possibility, and that could be a very powerful thing if it helps
mhm.
to things like healing. It also can be a really dangerous thing if the AI is sort of not yet responsible. And so I think
Yeah,
that's the double-edged sword here that is the reason why, Jiminy and I think a lot of our peer companies are being careful, obviously,
yeah.
as we deploy.
No, it absolutely makes makes total sense, right? Like it said like a real therapeutic alliance is something that maybe people are right. I mean, I think we have a line in the paper that's something like you know there that like okay, there's fundamentally a difference that we have culturally in acting between acting with interacting with a human, interacting with a AI chatbot, and that's not going to change unless we change what it means to interact with AI or change what it means to be human. Yeah, I mean, I do think to some extent, like both of those are changing. Maybe it is the case that like you'd actually feel really bad if you got angry at your chatbot buddy,
Right.
right?
And maybe
Uh,
and maybe you should. I mean, in that
yeah, yeah.
in that it would help coach good behaviors, right?
Mhm,
Like,
mhm.
probably not useful. Like the fact that you could abuse the AI therapist and there's no human on the other end of it feeling that doesn't mean that that's a useful thing for you to
Yeah,
learn to do, right? So the fact that there does seem to be some alliance and some empathy,
yeah.
again, I think is actually probably important.
No, it's very interesting. But you're right. It's fraught with like issues here. If
Wow.
it's not done really well, that it can isolate it can cause
Yeah.
it do lead people further down bad trajectories.
It's
Yeah,
interesting too. One of the other things that jumped out at me as I was reading the paper was you found that the LLMs, for example, missed issues with delusions, suicidal ideation, OCD, a variety of other things,
mhm,
roughly 20% of the time, which is way too often. But the other thing that I saw in there was that human therapists were missing these 7% of the time.
mhm.
And one of the things that jumped out at me was the possibility, of course, for using the tools to help train the therapists.
Yeah,
Uh, that
yeah,
that that as we have started to build AV systems, autonomous vehicle systems, someday the dream is self-driving, and if we have Waymo-like stuff in all the cars, 50,000 people a year in the United States who die in car accidents will not die, and it'll be wonderful. In the meantime, the sort of AV light stuff that's in all these cars, I think, is not only helping to prevent a lot of accidents, it is helping to teach people to be better drivers, I think. So every time your car kind of steers you back into the lane, or you get that yellow light on on your side view when you were about to move over into the other lane, hopefully it's also teaching you to like, oh, you should have looked over your shoulder first.
Right. Right.
I so one of the things we're really curious about, because Sage, our AI, works in conjunction with your therapist, is that over time, like a good care team, right? There's no reason that the nurse can't be nudging the doc when she's about to make a mistake, and they're learning from each other, right? I think that there's a dynamic there that could be really interesting over time, between sort of the human and AI elements in a mental health setting.
I think, yeah, I think it seems very likely that we're like be able to use be able to use AI systems to help train therapists, both, make an AI system be a patient, and having it be like you know, a helper, right?
Yeah.
It's something that like you're monitoring, maybe it makes mistakes and you can learn, from that as you go.
I
And
think
we'll
that's right.
also,
I think they call it the machine-mediated human behavior shaping is the mouthful that people
yeah,
in the
yeah, yeah.
industry use. I think everything in healthcare could use this. It's funny. So I spent some time years ago at a company. It was in molecular diagnostics, and it was a pretty advanced test that had sort of fairly complex results that would result in fairly complex decisions for oncologists. And we worked very hard to provide very clear information for the oncologist in regards to sort of what this meant in regards to the patient journey. And ultimately, it was up to the doc to decide what therapy should the patient go on, because they had the complete picture, that included more than, say, just the genomic profile of somebody's tumor. But we were helping to train the way that they were thinking about the problem, for sure, with this sort of it was ultimately kind of its own version of AI mediation.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that, right. I mean, there's like a phrase I love from the ed school here by a colleague, Roy P. Right? Cognitive reorganization, right? These tools are changing who we are, right? They're changing the sorts of tasks that we do, how we, right? And in a simple way, like you know, our smartphones made it so that we no longer remember phone numbers
Right.
manually, right? That's a really simple example. Our calculators changed how we do, right? This spreadsheet changed how we make decisions in financial context, right? This is perhaps a much more profound one where we can get these sorts of, right. Oh, it's actually
We
doing,
change our
a lot
environment,
of
our
decision
environment
making.
changes us. I actually, I
Yeah.
completely agree. And I will tell you, as a father of small children, one of the most fascinating things is that my 9-year-old now, it's not only that she assumes that there is a known answer to every question on earth, she also assumes that it is immediately accessible, and probably the person to ask is not me, but Siri or Alexa. And of course, my Silicon Valley joke would be like, no, no, you want to ask you. Oh, that's funny. That's Alexa waking up right now. But my answer to her would actually be, actually, you don't want to ask Siri. You probably want to ask, Claude or ChatGPT. Bad joke at Apple's expense. But I actually think that, more interestingly, like, she's not necessarily inclined to ask me. Right?
Right.
We're here
Right.
like, "Hey, no, no, the wisdom of elders." I might know the answer to that. Of course, the interesting thing is not so much my 9-year-old, but my 3-year-old will keep asking why always,
Yeah.
until, in fact, I don't know the answer, because, like, the answer is something to do with particle physics. Like, it's like, 'cause, like, "Well, we want you to brush your teeth." "Why?" "Well, because you don't wanna have cavities." "Why?"
Yeah.
Yeah, like, okay, but at some point, I do not know
Form
the
of
answer.
resistance. Yeah. 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 Yeah, but yeah, it's a profound thing, right? It's a shift to, accessibility and representation of information, that we're radically changing how that happens. I mean, and I think we'll keep seeing these. these changes in how we represent and access information.
For
Uh,
sure, for sure. So I'm curious. I mean, you guys wrote this paper, and of course, um, uh, spent a lot of time thinking about sort of what makes for appropriate behavior from an AI therapist, et cetera.
Mhm.
Did you take a look at any of the evaluation frameworks? So there's something called Client Cast, for example, that's out there, ready, and others that people are sort of trying to develop, so that among other things, we can kind of score what our answers are like. And we have our own at Jiminy, we have our own ways of thinking about this, actually largely related to like, what do our panel of expert therapists think of this discursive turn that the AI would have produced. But I'm
Right.
curious if what you think of the various frameworks.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, I'll have to like plead that I guess I don't know every I don't know every aspect of these sorts of frameworks myself at this point. Yeah, I mean, interested to take a look
Yeah, no, it's
as
fair. I
we go
mean, I
forward.
think it's, as with all emerging technologies, even the way we judge emerging technologies is, of course, evolving along with it. Or in the same way that we're trying to figure out. I mean, of course, all these debates about how much reasoning is actually happening, and how do we evaluate what even is reasoning, and how do we evaluate when that's happening. And
Yeah,
what's fascinating to me is that we keep moving the goalposts, because because we keep exceeding what anybody thought was going to be possible. Now we're solving math problems that we didn't think that were going to be, Fields medalists can't solve, and well, it's still not enough. Anyways,
right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think like broadly speaking, there's like this is like a really critical things for academic AI to be putting energy into is like figuring out the right ways to benchmark. They're imperfect. They're ever evolving. You know, I that app that that reasoning uh, debate has been a fun one.
yeah, 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 for sure. We're going to come up on time here soon, but I wanted to ask you, one of the questions. So I'm particularly interested for somebody sort of multidisciplinarian like you, sort of a mathematician slash computer scientist, but who works in school of ed. What are some interesting pieces of content that you've consumed recently that you think people are interested in this field would enjoy? And this could be a book, could be a podcast, it could be like a TV show you watched recently. No fair saying Black Mirror, but anything else is on limits, that you think has been just sort of interesting or thought provoking. It doesn't have to be recent. This could have been something you read as a kid that influenced your journey towards this kind of work.
Oh, that's a good question.
I should have prepped you with this in
Prep me
advance.
with this one. I got to think
Yeah,
about this. This is yeah, it's sort of yeah, it's tricky because I think a lot of like what I draw inspiration from isn't necessarily like a particular bit of media, but just sort of seeing all of the zeitgeist of what this is how people are engaging with AI. Like this is their they have they're doing coaching, they're doing like they're building things, they're engaged in like longer term relationships with these systems. It's right. I mean, I guess I mean, maybe kind of like dodging your question a little bit, but it's just like I think that it's always so hard to predict how technology is going to change who we are and how we think and what we do. But we're seeing this like large scale adaptation experiment. AI is getting better. Humans start to use it in different ways. And I think just like it's been wild to have a pulse on that, to the extent that one can. So maybe that's kind of dodging your
no,
question.
it's
It's
not.
not a
No, I think
particular
I think that's
piece,
right. I
but
mean, so maybe the answer is, rather than watching a show, you get to watch what's happening on the Stanford campus.
yeah.
Which I mean, certainly I feel the benefits of that, and
Yeah.
I would agree that sort of, if you want your finger on the pulse, it's maybe the way people say it sometimes, the future is already here. It's just not evenly
Mhm.
distributed,
Yeah.
and having an opportunity to sort of watch what the students are working on and how they're interacting with the AI. As I talked earlier about the way my daughter, my 9-year-old, thinks about interacting with AI is different than the way I do, and probably more representative of, like, she's not just a digital native, she's AI native, basically.
Right,
Right.
right. Yeah, it's like observing, right, it's like it's been interesting observing like code generation, how
Oh,
work with really good coders here, and you can see how they've been adapting. That's an
it's
interesting
completely changed
window.
development, completely changed
Uh,
development. Yes.
yeah.
I abandoned software development over 30 years ago. But I always loved making products, and I actually think that had we had the software tools, and it was just like one too many memory leaks in my C code where I spent 7 hours like tracking down like the bug, and I was like done. And I do think that had I grown up with like Lovable or Cursor,
Hmm. Hmm.
and modern programming languages, like I did love the making things and the joy of watching the thing work after you made it.
Yeah.
So I might have stuck with
Hmm.
it. Who knows? Of course, I'm not sure it'd
It's
be a useful skill for me to have stuck with, but um,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
so,
No.
so Nick, thank you so much for the time today. This was really fun and interesting, and really thank you for the work. We do think that a thoughtful approach to what makes for safe and effective therapy vis-a-vis AI is incredibly important. If we, the industry, get this wrong, we can sort of poison the well for a long time. And given the sort of urgent need for more effective therapy and more of it, we would like to see this done right. And so I think papers like yours and various frameworks in the ways people are thinking about like what's the right way to measure what's happening with these is
Yeah.
ultimately going to be really important for the industry.
Yeah, no, I will really appreciate that, and it's really, really fun conversation. Some really good, yeah, really good topics to broach. I really appreciate you having me on. Been a
Awesome.
pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Neural Compass, the Jiminy podcast. If today's conversation sparked something for you, follow us at Instagram, YouTube, or LinkedIn, or explore more at jiminyhealth.com. At Jiminy, we're building the future of mental health care with effective, safe, AI-enabled continuous care. See you next time.